This week, we are going to learn how to do what I think is some fun things in Jamovi. So I hope you agree. In the first video, we are going to learn how to create new variables using these tools in Jamovi that are called transform and compute. The idea is we often want to create new variables in Jamovi. So we have our raw data, we have the raw scores from a survey that we've conducted, for example, but sometimes we want to use that data in new ways. We want to combine it or recode it. So we want to make new variables. And this is what transform and compute allows you to do. We're going to start with transform. Okay, and we are going to open our Jamovi file. We're going to work with here. Okay, so here I have it beside me. And this is the same file that we used for the Topic3a videos, which contains data from almost 200 former STAT students on questions like self-esteem, pizza preferences, COVID attitudes, etc. So this is the same file that we worked with last week, or when we did Topic3, just with a couple small differences, which I'll get to, but essentially it's the same file. So the transform function is used in Jamovi when we want to recode the levels of an existing variable. Easiest way to see how this works and to understand how it works is with an example. So we are going to use the enjoy academic life variable. I'll pull it up here. See it? So this variable was the question where students were asked on a scale from 1 to 10, how much do you enjoy the academic life of university? Right? So that's the question that we're working with here. And you can recall that people who said they didn't enjoy academic life at all would rate it a 1 all the way to 10 if you enjoyed academic life extremely. But say that I wanted a variable that instead of the 1 to 10, the full range of 1 to 10 scores, I wanted a variable that divided people into 3 groups. So low, moderate, and high, based on how much they report enjoying academic life. So I'm going to make some cutoffs here. I'm going to say that I'm defining low enjoyment as academic life. So anyone who scored between 1 to 3 on this variable. Okay, so if you say, anywhere between 1 and 3 is your score on enjoy academic life, I'm going to say you're going to be in the low group. Anyone whose score was between 4 and 6 is going to be in a moderate group, or they're going to get a score of moderate. And then I'm going to define anyone whose score was 7 or higher as individuals in the high enjoyment group. So basically, I'm truncating my 1 to 10 scale into 3 categories: low, medium, and high. And we can use transform to do this. So how do we group participants on this 1 to 10 scale into 3 groupings? Here's what we do. So you can follow along with the instructions here and also work in Jamovi. So you're going to go to data and then add. Data. Sorry, there's two places where it says add. We always want, for now when we're doing transform, kind of the one in the middle block here. So data, make sure you're not getting the right one. Make sure you are getting the right one. This one here, add, and you'll see it. You'll know it's right, because if you click on this one, it's not going to give you what you want. You want add transform variable, and I'm going to ask you to always put the variable at the end, which is the append option. I think it just makes it easier to work with if all of the variables that you've created are at the end of the data set. If you do insert, it will put it just wherever your cursor currently is in the middle of the data set, which I personally don't like. Okay, so now you have this new variable that pops up. See, it's a new transformed variable, right? So what you have to do now is you are going to identify a source variable. Okay. So the source variable is just the the original variable, the variable that is in the data set currently. It's what you want to use to make your new variable. So in this case, we are selecting, you can select any of the variables in your data set to transform, but for this example, we're working with enjoy academic life. So when you do that, the original name in bracket with a bracket 2 is going to pop up into the variable name, because you have to, this is a variable like any other, and you have to give it a name. Jamovi will default to just putting the original name and then brackets 2. I'm going to say, give it a new name, call it, just put recoded on the end. That's fine. You can really call it whatever you want, but it's got to have a name that is unique from the original source variable name. Okay. And then description is often really useful in a transformed variable, because at a glance, if you click on it, if you include a good description, you'll be able to very quickly remember what it was that you did to this variable. So I'm going to just call it low, medium, high enjoyment of academic life. Okay, so we have a new variable, we've given it a name and a description. So how do we get it to make these groupings that we want it to? Well, we are going to click create new transform. So here's the drop-down menu for making transforms. So create new transform. You can see this looks different maybe from what you have, because it remembers transforms that you have used in the past. So I've played with some other transforms. You won't have anything here. If yours look just like this, then that's fine. You want to click on create new transform. So that's bringing up this new window, and this is where you do the actual transforming of the values. This is where we're going to make our 3 groupings, low, medium, and high, based on the 1 to 10 scores. So what you can do here is you can actually give your transform a name, which becomes handy later on if you're working with multiple transforms. Let's see that drop-down menu that I pulled down. You can see I had many transforms, and if I label it properly, then I can use it again, and I know which one exactly to use. So it's good to give it a name, and you want to give it a name that describes what it is you are doing to the variable. So I'm going to call it something like this: recode 1 to 10 scale into low, medium, high. Right? You could have further information in the description that might be relevant sometimes, but for now, what we're doing here, just giving it a descriptive name is fine. All right. So now you are going to click add recode condition. Okay, until there are 2 boxes that start with source. So it looks like a $ and source. Remember, the source variable is like the original variable that you're working with. Okay, so you are going to write some simple commands in here that tell Jamovi what to do in the new variable based on values of the old variable. Okay, so we're going to tell Jamovi how to recode the original variable into low, medium, or high according to the criteria, which I described above there. Okay. So I'm just translating that criteria into code, which is very simple. So here's what we're going to do. So recall that in my criteria, I said that anyone who's, I'm going to start at the high end. So starting with high. So I said anyone whose score is 7 or higher, I'm going to call them high, and they're in the high group. So here's how I do that in my code. So if source is greater than or equal to 7, then use, that means in the new variable, use the value label high. Okay. And it is important that anytime you're using text to create a new value in a transform, you have to put it in quotation marks. It's not going to work if you don't put in quotation marks. So that's a common error people come to me with and say, I can't work the recode. Often what they've done is they've forgotten to put quotes around the text values. Okay. So that is that. Then the next thing I'm going to do is create my low group. And remember, I said that people who were reporting a score between 1 and 3 were going to be in the low group. So I'm going to say if score is less than or equal to 3, use low. All right. So this is telling Jamovi, anyone who has a score of 1, 2, or 3, give them in this new transform value, in this new transform variable, they will have the value low as their score, right? And kind of the nice thing that you can do with variables like this, where you have low, medium, and high groups, is you identify your high group and your low group. And then you can use this else use, which means that any scores that don't fall into the categories that you've created above, give them a different value. So in other words, if you're not greater than or equal to 7, and you're not less than or equal to 3, then you are going to be in the medium group. By default, you will have a score of either 4, 5, or 6. So else use will give me my medium group. Okay. All right, so that should work. And you can see that it did. Now I have this new recoded enjoy academic life variable, in which everyone has a score of either high, medium, or low based on the transform criteria that I set. The next thing I want to show you how to do is to use a transform with text data. Okay, so in this last example that we used, the data was numeric. It was a continuous measure type. It had numerical data. And so that enabled me to, for example, use operators such as, greater than and equals to form those new values. But what if you don't have numeric values? What do you do? So this is what I'm going to go over here. And for this example, we are going to use the social media question, which was here. And the values were text, right? They were words. And how do we recode words? Okay, let's do an example using this one. So we're going again we're sticking on data here and then add. Again, we're appending a transformed variable. Now it's given us this new transform variable without a name. We are going to pick our source variable, which we know is going to be social media. Okay, so let's give it a really creative name like social media recoded. And say what I want to do here is I want to recode social media into low and high categories. Okay, so say I want to group people who report using social media between 2 hours or less a day into the low category, and then anyone who is reporting 3 or more hours of use, so falling into these 2 categories here, I want them to be in a high category, right? And in order to do that, we are going to just do exactly the same thing as we did in the academic life example. So we're identifying the source variable. We're going to create a new transform because this is going to be new values that we're recoding here. And so we want to add 4 recode conditions here. And again, there's kind of different ways you can do it, but I just wanted to show you the most straightforward way. And so we are going to create these recode conditions. So I'm just going to do the first example here. So my first value for the social media variable is less than 1 hour, right? And so this is also an example that will show you how to recode when you have not a range of values that you're recoding into a single value, but like one specific value that you're recoding. So for example, less than 1 hour, that's one specific value that you're recoding into a different value on the new transform. But in those cases, you use equals equals. So if it's one value, you use equals equals. So not equals. That's another common mistake that I see people make on their assignments. Say it's not working, and if they have quote marks, then I'll often say check your equals. Do you have two equals? So if source equals equals, and then you're putting in exactly how the wording that is exactly how it appears on the levels window of the original variable. So, by that, I mean, if you go to the social media variable, see how, like less than 1 hour, that exact, like there's a capital on L, 1 is a number. That's what I mean. Like in order to recode properly, you have to have the correct spacing, capitalization, all of that has to be exactly as it appears in this levels window when you go and do the transform. Okay, I seem to have lost my transform when I went back to that other variable. So let's just create a new transform here. Okay, so you can give it a name. Social media into low and high groups. And here's the recode conditions. So starting with the first one and going to the fourth. So I just went and typed that out. Again, just noticing the equals equals, and the text should be surrounded by single quote marks. Okay, so now I'm telling Jamovi, if my source variable was 1 to 2 hours, then in my new transform variable, the score for anyone who had 1 to 2 hours is just going to be low. And then for either 3 to 4 hours or over 4 hours, if that was someone's score on the source variable, then in the new transform variable, their score will be high. Okay, so and you can see it populating here in the spreadsheet. All right, so again, there are different ways that you could do this and kind of use the transform function. And if you are handy with coding, you'll probably find ways to do it that are different than what I covered in this video. Okay, that's fine, but I just wanted to show you one way. So now we're going to use the self-esteem questions to do a slightly different type of transform. Transform is also really useful for what I call reverse scoring variables, and we're going to do an example to discover what that means. I also just want to say that this reverse scoring ends up being fairly commonly used by psychologists because it is something that we often do to self-report scales of, for example, personality questionnaires, mental health, depression, anxiety, those kinds of questionnaires that we commonly have people do as psychology/social science people. And so this reverse scoring thing is something that that you just do often as someone who works with data in the social science field. So that's part of the reason why I'm showing you how to do this. So I want you to take a look now at the 10 self-esteem items. So you might remember that in last week's video, we also used the self-esteem questions, but there were only 5 of them. And that's because just for what we wanted to do last week, I just wanted to present a reduced version. But actually the self-esteem scale that I used is 10 items. Okay, so now I included them all, 1 through 10. And I want to point out a couple of things about those questions to you. Okay. So in the full scale, that is all of the 10 questions, some of the self-esteem items were positively worded and some were negatively worded. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Positively worded are questions where higher scores on that question would be indicative of someone who feels good about themselves, who has higher self-esteem. So, this Let's start at the first one. I feel that I'm a person of worth, at least on an equal basis with others. Okay? That's a positively worded item. People who have higher scores on that would have higher self-esteem. They feel better about themselves. That's true for number 2 as well. I have a number of good qualities. But look at number 3. Here's an example of a negatively worded item. And this is an item where people with higher scores would actually have lower self-esteem. Okay, so remember that these questions were answered on a scale from 1 to 4. Okay, so I actually just went in and for each of the self-esteem items, put in a little bracket in the description just to remind you that what the values were, right? 1 through 4, where 1 is strongly disagree, 4 is strongly agree. Okay, so you'll see that in your data set. But the idea is that all of these questions, positively and negatively worded, are answered on the same 1 to 4 scale. Okay, so this means that sometimes a person who feels good about themselves will have a high score on a self-esteem question, right? So someone who answered strongly agree to the question, I have a number of good qualities, is, someone who feels good about themselves, has a high score. But sometimes a person who feels good about themselves will actually have a low score on one of those questions, right? If you answered 1, if you have a score of 1 on the question, I don't have much to be proud of, you still feel good about yourself, but you've got a low score. So again, we have the situation where we have these positively and negatively worded items, and ideally we would want all of the items to be scored in the same direction, so that for all of those 10 items, everyone who has high scores on each of those items is someone who feels good about themselves, right? We want high scores to mean you have higher self-esteem. And this is we want that coding to be consistent for all 10 questions, because ultimately what we want to do is we want to combine those 10 questions into an average. Okay? But before we can combine them, we need to make sure that each question is scored in such a way that higher scores indicate higher self-esteem. Okay? So we can't kind of take the average, it doesn't make sense to take the average of positively worded and negatively worded items, because they're not going to give us a sum number where higher scores reflect higher self-esteem. So the solution to this conundrum, which is very common in psychological research using these types of personality or mental health questionnaires, often you have half of them are worded positively, half of them are worded negatively. Before you can combine them, you have to recode the negatively worded items so that higher scores actually mean higher self-esteem. Here's what we do. So what I usually do is I go and for a scale, I mark the negatively worded questions with _R, and that just reminds me that those questions need to be reverse coded or recoded before we can combine them. So I believe I went and did that. I did that for you, right? So all the negatively worded questions are going to have an _R underneath them. And that, as you'll see, just makes it easier to identify those variables when you go to do the transform. So we're going to go to transform again. So what we're doing is we're going to be reverse coding those negatively worded questions, which I've marked with an _R. So we go to data and then add, append, transformed for the first variable that we want to transform. So we're going to the source variable menu. And this is what I mean by, putting that little _R under it. Just makes it really easy to pick out from this menu the items that you want to reverse code. So the first one is 3. And I think, I don't know, we'll call it recode, something like that. And then we are going to create a new transform. You can create a new transform, and we're going to call that reverse values 1, 2, 4. And as you can imagine, what we'll do, there actually are different ways to do this too, but we're going to stick to really simple way where we're saying if the source variable is 1, okay, then in our new recoded variable, that person's going to get a score of 4, right? Because we're reverse coding. And we're going to do that for 2. And now for 3. So if our source variable is 3 in the new transform variable, it's going to be 2. And then finally, if our source variable is 4, our new variable is going to be 1. Right? So think about how this makes sense, right? In a negatively worded question, okay, which is like, I don't feel very good about myself. If you're answering 4, you're saying, I strongly agree with the statement, I don't feel good about myself. You want that person to have a low score, right? So that's what this recode essentially does. Someone who strongly disagrees with the question, I don't feel very good about myself, they actually have high self-esteem. So you want them to have a high score. So again, that's what we do here. All right, so we now have our first negatively worded self-esteem question reverse coded. And now we're going to go and do the other variables that need to be reverse coded. So Jamovi makes this really easy for us. We can navigate through here. So next variable, and you can tell it to create a new transformed variable. You could do it the other way that I showed you too, but this is just quicker. So now we're identifying our next source variable. We're just looking for that next self-esteem variable with the underscore R. And here's the beautiful thing. First you want to just rename that. We don't need to do the 1 to 4 recode again because it's going to save it for us. So it's saved reverse code 1 to 4, and it will do that for us. Right, so kind of work along with me as we do the recodes for the other self-esteem variables as well. Okay, I'm just going to pause it. You can pause it too. Go ahead and do the work, and then when it's done, you can press play on the video again. So go do those recodes. Okay, so now we have our 5 negatively worded self-esteem questions that have been reverse coded. All right. So I think that we have completed all of the information up to here. The next thing we're going to do is move from the transform function to the compute function, which is another way to create new variables in Jamovi from original or source variables. Compute is a little bit different because what it does is it allows us to combine variables in different ways. So for example, one of the most common things that we tend to do in social science statistics is to create an average variable from multiple variables. We might sum scores on multiple variables. We can use calculations to compute z-scores. So it's combining variables, making calculations to create a new variable from original source variables. So let's go and look at what a computed variable does. So we're going to click add, just as we did before, but instead of clicking on transform, now we're clicking on append computed variable. So now we have this new type of variable information window. It looks a little bit different than the one we've seen before. It's a computed variable. And what we do here is we can click on this function, see this function, this f subscript x. When you click on the function button, then these two windows appear. And these windows are going to allow us to grab variables in our data set. These are all the variables in our data set. You can see the last ones we did were those recoded variables. And we can grab the variables and tell Jamovi to do some math with these variables to compute a new variable. So what I want you to do as an example here is to take the average of the self-esteem questions to get an average self-esteem scale score for each person. And what I want you to do is to use the 10 items, and these are going to be not just like items 1 through 10, but it will be the positively worded original items and then the reverse ordered negatively worded items. That's what you're going to use to compute average self-esteem. So what does that look like? Well, it's pretty simple. You're just going into your window here. You're actually going to find in the functions menu, you're going to find mean. So click mean and see it pops up like that with two parentheses, and your cursor is inside the parentheses. And in the parentheses, you are just going to insert the variables that you want to use for the average. In this case, remember, we're doing the original positively worded self-esteem items and then the recoded negatively worded ones. So we're starting off with self-esteem 1, self-esteem 2. We're skipping 3 because we're going to pick that at the end. 6, 7, and then go all the way to the end of your data set. And here you're going to add in those negatively worded questions that you reverse coded. All right. So you can see that now we have a new variable that is the average of those 10 variables. And we're going to give it a name. Self-esteem average. So that's compute for now. Two quick last things for this. I know this is so long, I'm sorry. But second last topic here quickly is missing data in computed variables. As you know already, if someone didn't respond to a question in a survey, Jamovi is just going to leave it as blank, and then the blank gets downloaded, or Google Forms rather leaves it as blank, and Jamovi downloads it as blank, right? So it's just a missing cell. Something that I want to point out about missing data in computed variables is this. If someone is missing an answer to one of the variables that went into a computed average variable, then their computed average will be blank. Okay, so here's participant number 51 here. You can see that for one of the self-esteem questions, they left it blank. They just missed it or skipped it. So what's going to happen when we scroll over to their average self-esteem score, and you can see that it is just left blank, even though that person, I think, completed all of the other questions. So that's just what Jamovi does by default. Just keep that in mind that, again, if someone is missing a score for any one of the variables that go into a computed variable, they'll just get a missing on that variable. Last thing about missing data to bring up here is that you can, rather than leaving a variable as blank if someone is missing it, you can actually assign a numerical value associated with missing data. And I want to show you this because you encounter this quite a lot when you work with large data sets. So some of the data that we work with in the assignments for the World Values Survey, you will see this happen. So I'm going to show you this. Okay. So right now, kind of by default, a blank cell means missing. You can also, using this missing values window here, assign numbers to a missing value. So if I click on this, say, add missing value, when source, and that means the variable that we are in, that we are working with. So when source equals, and you could literally give it any value you want. Often what you're going to see is 999 is a common value that's given to missing data. So we'll stick with that. Enter that. That's all you need to do. Click off it, and then see missing value is 999. Okay. Then you would have to actually go in and write 999 in that cell and see what it does there. Because you've identified 999 as a missing value, it looks different, right? It kind of grays it out. And that is telling Jamovi that 999 shouldn't be treated as the number 999. It should be treated as a missing value. So treated as if there was nothing in that cell, as if that cell was blank. Okay, so again, just you may run into that in the world values survey with a variable having been assigned a missing value. And that's what it means. All right, and the very last thing I promise you is just a little bit about computing variables in Excel. Excel is a really popular program that you are sure to come across, and it's good to be able to know how to do some of this in Excel. And what I want to show you is how to use Excel to compute averages and things like that. All right, so what I want you to do is to open up Excel, follow along with the instructions on the handout. And I want you to, I'm going to copy and paste the first 10 participants on the numeric COVID questions from Jamovi into Excel. Okay, here they are. So here are the numeric COVID questions. We're just going to grab the first 10 participants. We're going to COVID 1, COVID 2, and COVID 3. And we're going to paste that data in there. If I wanted to create an average of these 3 scores for each person, here's what I would do. So in Excel, it uses the word average rather than mean. Okay, so when we were computing in Jamovi, we would write equals mean and then the variables that we wanted. In Excel, it likes average. So we're gonna, in one of these cells, right, average, and then brackets. Okay, so see what it's doing now is it wants us to insert the range of cells or to highlight the range of cells that it's going to use to calculate the average. Okay, so if we want it for that one person, just highlight those 3 cells, close the bracket, press enter. Okay, so now this is the average for this one person for those 3 questions. If you wanted to do a sum, very similar process. The word you want is sum. So equals sum, open the brackets, and you are going to highlight those same 3 variables, close the brackets, enter, and that is the sum of those numbers. All right, so Excel, there's a ton of commands you can use. I mean, if you just hit equals and start, at the top of the alphabet and work your way down, you can see there's just all kinds of endless things you can do with Excel. But we're keeping it very simple. All right, but what if you wanted to get the average for person 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6? Do you have to, do that all over again? No, you do not. You can simply click on the cell where you wrote the formula first and drag. So see, there's this little dot in the corner of the cell here. Grab it and drag it all the way down. And it gives you the average for everyone else. So you can see, so here, if you highlight that, see it's the average of the first person. So it moves it down, right? So there in that cell, it's the average for the second person. The next cell, it's the average for the third person, and so on. Okay, and then you can do the same for sum. Click on the cell where you wrote the formula, grab that little green dot, drag it down, and we're good.